As the Haswell architecture is getting 12 years old by now, the price of its Core i5 CPUs dropped below $10. But just because it got that cheap, does that make the i5-4570 a valid option in 2025? As seen on Intel's own webpage, the processor uses 4 non-hyper-threaded cores, which can boost up to 3.6 GHz. And while the manufacturer listed 84 watts for the TDP, I didn't see it use more than half of it during gaming. But more importantly, this architecture supports the AVX2 extensions, and we'll see the impact of that later on. As for the test system, I really wanted to use this tiny board from Gigabyte, the GAH81S2V, and this is why you don't see the CPU transplanted to the Z230 workstation. Now, there are some other consequences to this choice. The test system uses only 16GB of DDR3 at 1600 MHz in dual channel. The GTX 970 used is limited to the PCIe Gen 2 supported by the motherboard, but at the low resolution test used, this should make zero difference. And yes, like done with all CPUs reviewed this year, I used a video compression test to get a feel of the IPC, but we'll get to that after the gaming results. And we start off with Marvel Rivals, where the Haswell Core i5 managed 104 FPS on average. Now, 51 FPS for the 1% lows is below the 60 FPS threshold that I use for multiplayer games, but I will consider the gameplay low. To make sure the test stayed CPU limited, I use 720 resolution, 30% render scale and low settings. To test Cyberpunk 2077, I opted for a 1024x768 resolution, low settings and no FSR. And with the CPU as the main limiting factor, the Kent benchmark averaged 77 FPS. As for the 1% lows, it stayed in the low 50s, and with a 0.1% lows in the 30s, the game played just fine. Fortnite ran acceptably. I did my test run at 720 resolution, performance rendering mode and a draw distance set to far. The i5-4570 averaged 152 FPS. The 1% lows of 65 is still above the 60 FPS threshold that I mentioned earlier. But a gap that big between the average and the 1% lows means that the game will stutter once in a while, and this can also be noticed for the 0.1% lows of 16. In contrast, Rainbow Six Siege had an impressively fluid frame delivery, with the average at 193 FPS, the 1% lows at 133, and the 0.1% comfortably above 100. To make sure that the tested component was the i5-4570, I ran the benchmark at 720 resolution, low settings and 50% render scale. Apex Legends however behaved more like Fortnite, albeit with better 0.1% lows. I ran the test at 720 resolution and low settings, and despite the i5-4570 being used at 100%, according to Afterburner, the average FPS was a good 190 FPS. The 1% loss, however, at 69, while nice and all, does point out some frame delivery issues, as the 0.1% loss of 45 would confirm. Overwatch 2 had a somewhat similar behavior, with the CPU usage not dropping from high 90% usage, regardless of how much I waited for. The i5 averaged 424 FPS at 720 resolution and low settings, but the 1% lows were just above 200. You see, a smooth frame delivery would have that closer to 300 FPS, but in our case it fell 100 FPS short, and this can be seen also with the 0.1% lows. I'm going to take the chance on sounding like a broken record, but CS2 behaved somewhat the same, with average suspicious 1% lows and mediocre 0.1% lows. I ran around DA Dust 2 at 720 resolution, low settings and FSR disabled, and the i5 managed a good 149 FPS for the average, but an eyebrow raising of 72 for the 1% lows. The 0.1% lows at 45 doesn't look good either. And the trend continues with DOTA 2, which stays CPU limited at 1080 resolution and low settings. I made sure that the render scale is set to 100 and played the match replay. The 4570 managed 86 FPS for the average, matching my expectations from running the game on the Z230 workstation. The 1% loss of 51 FPS is still fine for this type of game, but the 0.1% of 25 might have people who actually play the game a bit worried. I failed to get Robocop to be fully CPU bound, as the GPU usage refused to become lower than the CPU usage, so the numbers here can be, at best, used to say that the Haswell i5 can play the game just fine. At 720 resolution, low settings and 50% render scale, the average FPS was in the mid-60s, with the 1% lows in the high 40s, and with 0.1% lows of 30, the game can be played just fine. Now, I used to play the finals on the Z230, so the results seen on screen were no surprise. At 720 resolution and low settings, the i5 managed an average FPS of 77. And as expected, the 1% loss was in the 30s, followed by some rather poor 0.1% loss of just 14. If you play the game casually and not competitively, this could just do it for you. I ran the built-in benchmark from Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and fortunately the i5-4570 managed to run it at acceptable frame rates. I used 800 by 600 for the resolution and lowest settings to make sure we stay as much as possible CPU bound, and the i5 averaged 83 FPS. The 1% lows were at 31, which is fine for a slower paced single player title. Borderlands 3 also ran fine. I used the built-in benchmark at 720 resolution, 50% render scale with low settings, and the CPU managed 96 FPS for the average and 62 for the 1% lows. The experience is quite okay, and the 0.1% lows do not detract from it. I tested control in DirectX 12 mode, but to make sure I was CPU bottlenecked, I dropped the resolution to 960 by 540. I also used the lowest possible settings and the CPU averaged 153 FPS. The 1% lows metrics was at 56 FPS, well above the threshold of 30 that I use for single player games. The game will stutter occasionally, as the 0.1% lows of 12 will point out. Okay, so I promised I'd put a number for the IPC of this processor. To do that, I timed how much it takes to do the final rendering for the GigASUS R9-270 video, multiplying that with the number of cores and the average frequency, and we get to a number of clock cycles that elapsed from the start of the rendering until it finished. The lower the number of cycles, the better the IPC. In case of the i5-4570, the rendering took almost 28 minutes, and with all the math mentioned above, this then gets us 22,464 trillion clock cycles needed to complete the rendering. To put it into perspective, this is faster than the older Standard Bridge i7-2600, but not quite as fast as the Zen Plus Ryzen 5 2600. But with only 28 watts consumed on average, this makes it one of the more efficient chips. The i5-4570 can still run a lot of the more popular online multiplayer titles. I know quite a few people that play only a handful of games, and all of them can run just fine on the Haswell chip. But to buy one now would mean that you'd be limited to those games alone. The $10 or less i5-4570 is a perfectly fine option for an office PC, with some gaming on the side. Furthermore, the Core i5 is probably a better option than the corresponding 4th Gen Core i7, since it offers about 80% of the performance of the i7 at most of the times half the price. We will check one of the hyper-threaded variants in a future video, allowing the Z230 workstation to make a comeback on the channel. As for this one, we're done. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you